In September of 1945, when the smoke of the deadliest war in human history had only just begun to thin over the Pacific, when the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still warm with a new and terrible silence, America's Iowa-class battleships stood at the absolute apex of naval power. They were the largest, fastest, and most heavily armed battleships the United States Navy had ever built. Steel colossi displacing over 45,000 tons at full load, armed with 9 16-inch guns capable of hurling a projectile the weight of a small automobile more than 20 miles through open air, plated with armor belt after armor belt of hardened steel that could absorb punishment that would have reduced any lesser vessel to wreckage. They were, in every measurable sense, the pinnacle of 4 centuries of battleship development, the final answer to a question that navies had been asking since the age of sail. But the answer had arrived too late. The era that made them necessary was already ending before the ink had dried on the surrender documents. What happened next? Almost no one remembers. There were 4 of them: the Iowa, the New Jersey, the Missouri, and the Wisconsin. And each carried its name like a promise made to a nation that had spent 4 years bleeding on 2 oceans simultaneously. They were built in a wartime frenzy between 1942 and 1944, rushed down the slipways of yards in New York and Philadelphia and Camden, sent to sea still smelling of fresh paint and welding smoke, crewed by young men from landlocked states who had never seen the ocean and who would spend the next years of their lives surrounded by nothing but it. These were not instruments of finesse. They were instruments of certainty. Mobile fortresses designed to project the singular, unarguable authority of steel and explosive force. In the last years of the Pacific War, they served primarily as escorts for the fast carrier task forces that had by then already rendered them philosophically obsolete. The battleship, it turned out, had been dethroned by the aircraft carrier long before the Iowa class had even been commissioned. But no one found it convenient to say so yet, and so the great ship steamed on, waiting for a role that suited their grandeur. The USS Missouri was the youngest of the 4, commissioned in June of 1944 and rushed to the Pacific in time for the final campaigns. She was present at Iwo Jima at Okinawa, where she absorbed a kamikaze strike on her starboard side, the impact leaving a dent and a scorch mark, and a dead Japanese pilot whom her crew buried at sea with full military honors, stitching a Japanese flag around the body because they had no other shroud available. That detail, small and strange and quietly devastating, tells you something about the kind of vessel she was. A machine of war, yes, but also a stage upon which human beings enacted rituals older than the machines themselves. And it was on the Missouri's teak-planked deck, on the morning of September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay under a gray and overcast sky, that General Douglas MacArthur presided over the formal surrender of Imperial Japan. The document was signed at a small mess table covered with a green baize cloth. The Japanese delegation stood stiffly in their formal dress uniforms. The Missouri's crew, hundreds of them, hung from every available superstructure, from the barrels of the 5-inch gun mounts, from the rangefinders and the observation platforms, packed together so tightly that the whole scene looked less like a military ceremony and more like a city crowd watching a parade. Above it all, the 16-inch gun turrets sat silent and massive, their barrels pointed harmlessly skyward, their purpose already, in some sense, completed. The war that had required their existence was over. The world they had helped to save would be rebuilt on the logic of nuclear deterrence, not of armor plate and powder bags. The Missouri had been present at the creation of the post-war order. She did not know yet that the post-war order had no room for her. The mothballing began almost immediately. Within 2 years of Japan's surrender, the Iowa, the New Jersey, and the Wisconsin had been stripped of their ammunition, their fuel emptied, their machinery preserved in nitrogen and cosmoline and silence, and placed in reserve at naval shipyards up and down the eastern seaboard. The Missouri lingered longer in active service, serving as a training ship, carrying President Harry Truman home from Europe in 1947 in a moment of presidential pageantry that briefly made her famous again. But by early 1950, she too was preparing for the indignity of the reserve fleet. the vast gray purgatory of warships that the Navy kept around because it could not bring itself to scrap them, because the memory of 1941 and the desperate scramble to rebuild a shattered fleet was still too fresh, because the admirals who had fought the war were not yet ready to surrender the tools with which they had won it. Then Korea intervened. In June of 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, and the United States, barely half a decade removed from the most devastating war in its history, found itself at war again. This time in a peninsula most Americans could not have located on a map. The Missouri was rushed back to readiness and sent to Korean waters, where her 16-inch guns proved devastatingly effective against shore targets, supply lines, troop concentrations, road junctions, and railroad marshaling yards. The others followed. The Iowa, the New Jersey, and the Wisconsin were all recommissioned, their cosmolines scraped away, their engines coaxed back to life by crews who had to relearn procedures that wartime sailors had known by instinct. They pounded the Korean coastline for months, their massive shells arcing over the hills and valleys of a country that had never asked to be the stage for a superpower conflict. Naval gunfire support, the doctrine was called, a phrase as bloodless as a bureaucratic memorandum concealing beneath its neutral syllables the reality of 900-pound shells arriving without warning from the sea. The Korean War ended in an armistice in 1953. The battleships went back to the reserve fleet. Again, they were drained and silenced and preserved. Again, the admirals argued about their utility. Again, the accountants noted the enormous cost of maintaining vessels that belonged structurally and philosophically to a different age. The debate would not be resolved. It would only be deferred. The 1950s were not kind to battleships. The decade was defined by the hydrogen bomb and the intercontinental ballistic missile and the nuclear-powered submarine, technologies that made the notion of a steel warship trading gunfire with another steel warship seem almost quaint. The aircraft carrier had consolidated its supremacy at the center of American naval doctrine. The battleship had no clear place in a world where a single B-52 flying at altitude could deliver a weapon of city-ending force before any surface ship had even entered the threat envelope. The Iowa class sat in reserve, growing older, accumulating the particular melancholy of machinery that was built to move and has been stopped. Their hulls were painted and repainted to keep rust at bay. Their interiors were monitored for leaks and humidity. They were kept, but they were not used. And there is a cruelty in keeping something that was built to be used. The New Jersey alone broke the pattern. In 1967, as the Vietnam War ground on and the demand for naval gunfire support in the shallow coastal waters of Southeast Asia mounted beyond what the Navy's cruisers and destroyers could efficiently provide, she was recommissioned for the third time. Her 16-inch guns could reach targets miles inland, could flatten bunkers, and obliterate staging areas that aircraft could not reliably destroy with bombs. She arrived in Vietnamese waters in September of 1968, the only battleship to serve in that conflict, and she delivered more fire in a single month than most cruisers managed in a year. Her crew was smaller than in the previous wars. The Navy had learned to do more with fewer hands, and her fire control systems had been modestly updated, but fundamentally she was the same ship that had fought in Korea, the same ship that had been built in the early years of the Second World War. She was an anachronism already. She was also, in the coastal waters of Vietnam, extraordinarily effective, but effectiveness was not the argument. The argument was cost. Maintaining a battleship was expensive in ways that resisted easy quantification. It was not just the fuel and the ammunition and the crew, but the entire logistical infrastructure of a vessel class that no longer had standardized parts in general production, whose systems were increasingly incompatible with modern Navy supply chains, whose expertise was held by an aging generation of sailors with nowhere to pass it on. The New Jersey was decommissioned again in 1969, less than 2 years after her reactivation, and sent back to reserve. The lesson the Navy drew was not that battleships were obsolete. The lesson was more complicated and less comforting than that. The lesson was that the ships were too expensive to maintain continuously, but too capable to discard entirely. The 1970s brought the Iowa class to the deepest point of its long decline. All 4 ships sat in reserve at Puget Sound and at Philadelphia and at Bremerton, aging in ways that were increasingly difficult to reverse. The reserve fleet is not a gentle environment. A warship in reserve is, in a technical sense, preserved. But preservation is not the same as maintenance, and the difference accumulates over time in corrosion and seized machinery and degraded wiring and the slow, patient defeat of engineered systems by the chemistry of salt air and time. The engineers who inspected the Iowa class in the mid-1970s came back with reports that were, in private, alarming. The propulsion plants were deteriorating. The electrical systems were outdated by decades. The fire control computers, such as they were, predated the transistor. The ships were not lost, but they were drifting, incrementally, toward a condition from which recovery would be prohibitively expensive. It was, in retrospect, the closest the Iowa class ever came to oblivion. Congress had periodic conversations about scrapping the ships altogether. The Navy's surface warfare community, which had been eclipsed by the aviators and the submariners in the post-Vietnam years, argued for keeping them. The arguments were as much about institutional identity as they were about military utility. Battleships represented a certain kind of naval power, a visible, tangible, undeniable projection of force that aircraft carriers, for all their lethality, did not quite replicate. An aircraft carrier is invisible power. The aircraft are the weapon, and the carrier itself is merely the platform from which they operate. A battleship is visible power. When it appears on the horizon, the statement it makes is immediate and unmistakable. In the 1970s, as Soviet naval power expanded and American influence contracted in the wake of Vietnam, that argument had a particular resonance. But arguments rarely defeat budgets. The ship sat. The rust worked. The decade turned. Ronald Reagan was elected in November of 1980 on a platform that included, among its many commitments, the promise to restore American military power to what he characterized as its rightful preeminence. The Carter-era defense budgets had been, by the standards of the Cold War, modest. Reagan's vision was different. A 600-ship Navy, blue-water dominance, the projection of American power into every ocean simultaneously. It was an enormously ambitious program, and it required, among other things, finding hulls. New warships took years to build. The Iowa class was already built, and it was available. The decision to modernize and recommission all 4 Iowa-class battleships was made in the early years of the Reagan administration, driven primarily by the Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, who was an enthusiast for battleships in a way that was, among naval professionals, considered slightly eccentric. Lehman saw in the Iowa class not a relic, but an opportunity. Vessels whose fundamental hull strength and gun firepower could be augmented with modern weapon systems to create what he called a surface action group capable of threatening any Soviet surface force. The modernization program that followed was, by any measure, extraordinary. The ships were taken into the yards and transformed. Their rear 16-inch gun turret on each ship was surrounded by new superstructure. 32 Tomahawk cruise missiles were installed in armored box launchers amidships. 16 Harpoon anti-ship missiles were added. Phalanx close-in weapon systems, capable of firing 3,000 rounds per minute, were bolted to the superstructure. Electronic warfare suites, satellite communications, improved radar. The ships were not rebuilt so much as they were grafted, the bones of 1943 receiving the organs of 1983. The result a kind of hybrid entity that had no precise precedent in naval history. The Iowa class returned to sea. They were, once again, formidable. They were also, once again, answers to a question that had evolved beyond their capacity to fully address. The recommissioned battleships spent the 1980s at the center of a renewed American naval assertiveness that was, in some ways, genuinely effective and, in other ways, largely theatrical. They made port visits. They exercised with allied navies. They were photographed from every possible angle, their 40-year-old hulls freshly painted, their new cruise missile launchers gleaming in the sun, their 16-inch turrets still dominant and massive and faintly anachronistic against the backdrop of modern naval architecture. The Iowa served in the Atlantic. The New Jersey was deployed to the Mediterranean and then to the Lebanese coast during the chaos of 1983 and 1984, where her guns fired on Syrian positions in the mountains above Beirut, the last time American battleship guns would fire in anger. The shells landed where they were aimed, and the political outcome of the Lebanese intervention was a disaster, and the New Jersey steamed away, and the debate about what precisely a battleship was for in the modern world continued without resolution. The Missouri and Wisconsin were deployed to the Pacific. They exercised. They showed the flag. They were expensive to operate, requiring crews of over 1,500 men, far larger than the automated warships the Navy was building in the same years. The cost-per-effect calculations that defense analysts produced were rarely favorable to the battleships, but Lehman continued to argue for them, and the Cold War continued to provide justification for maintaining maximum visible deterrence. And so the ships continued to operate, burning fuel oil in quantities that would have been considered extravagant even in wartime, sending the smoke of their boilers across the waters of every ocean the United States Navy patrolled. Then came April 19, 1989. The USS Iowa was conducting gunnery exercises in the Atlantic, approximately 300 miles northeast of Puerto Rico. The crew was practicing the loading and firing of the center gun of Turret 2, the middle of the three massive 16-inch turrets amidships. Something went wrong. The precise cause has never been definitively established. The investigation and the subsequent congressional hearings and the reinvestigations and the appeals to the Navy's own findings produced over the following years more heat than light. What is not disputed is the result. An explosion inside the turret killed 47 men instantly, a detonation of powder bags that turned the interior of Turret 2 into a chamber of fire and concussive force from which there was no survival. The Iowa was at sea when it happened, 300 miles from the nearest land, and her crew fought the fire and controlled the flooding and saved the ship while 47 of their shipmates were dead inside a steel compartment that had not yet cooled enough to enter. The explosion aboard the Iowa was not the end of the battleship program, but it was the beginning of the end. The Navy's initial investigation produced conclusions that were contested and eventually largely withdrawn. The investigation's original finding, that a disgruntled sailor had deliberately caused the explosion, was challenged by technical experts and by the dead sailor's family, and eventually by the Navy itself, which acknowledged in 1991 that the cause remained undetermined. What the explosion did beyond killing 47 men was to concentrate attention on the fundamental reality of maintaining early 1940s propulsion and ordnance systems in a Navy whose institutional expertise in those systems was aging and finite. The people who had grown up with 16-inch guns, who had known by feel and experience when something was wrong in the loading cycle, were old or dead. The technical manuals existed, but manuals cannot substitute for embodied knowledge, for the kind of understanding that lives in the hands of someone who has done a thing 10,000 times. The Cold War ended with a speed that surprised almost everyone. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989, 7 months after the Iowa explosion. The Soviet Empire contracted and then collapsed. The naval threat that had justified the 600-ship Navy diminished, not gradually, but precipitously. Defense budgets were cut. Programs were canceled. The Iowa class, which had been recommissioned at enormous expense as part of a strategy for confronting Soviet naval power, found itself in a world where that power had simply ceased to exist. The Gulf War of 1990 and 1991 gave the Missouri and Wisconsin one final moment. They fired Tomahawk cruise missiles into Iraq in the opening hours of the air campaign, and their 16-inch guns shelled Iraqi positions along the Kuwaiti coast, and the battleships were, for a brief and strange interlude, relevant again, tools in a war whose geography and character suited them. But it was a final gesture, not a revival. The Missouri was decommissioned in March of 1992. The Wisconsin followed days later. The Iowa and New Jersey had already been deactivated. The great ships were done. The years after decommissioning were, for the Iowa class, a long argument about what they were worth and what they meant and what should be done with them. The Navy initially kept them in a state called Inactive Ship Maintenance Facility, a bureaucratic category that meant they were preserved but not operational, maintained at minimum cost while the service debated their future. Congress, which had funded their modernization, was reluctant to authorize their scrapping. Veterans organizations lobbied for their preservation. Historians argued about their significance. The ships themselves sat in reserve facilities and accumulated the quiet damage of time, their paint fading, their systems degrading, their hulls settling slightly in the still water of the berths they had occupied for years. The question of what to do with them was answered eventually by the museums and the cities that wanted them. The Missouri was donated to the USS Missouri Memorial Association and berthed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, at the exact location, Pier F5, Battleship Row, where the USS Arizona had been sunk on December 7, 1941. The symbolism was calculated, and it was apt. The ship on whose deck the war had formally ended, moored permanently over the wreck of the ship whose sinking had begun it. The Arizona leaks oil still, a slow seep from her ruptured fuel tanks, and the black drops rise to the surface of the harbor water where the Missouri floats above, and the two ships occupy together the beginning and the end of the Pacific War in a way that no monument could replicate. The New Jersey was berthed in Camden, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, where she had been built. The Iowa went to Los Angeles, the Wisconsin to Norfolk, Virginia. All four ships survived. All four survive still, maintained by the volunteer labor of veterans and the entrance fees of tourists and the municipal pride of the cities that have claimed them. The preservation of all four ships was not inevitable. It required sustained advocacy, significant funding, and the willingness of private organizations and local governments to absorb the ongoing costs of maintaining vessels that are, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily expensive to keep. Battleships do not become cheap simply because they are no longer firing their guns. They are enormous, complex steel structures requiring constant attention to prevent the corrosion and structural degradation that would otherwise reduce them within a generation to rust and ruin. The people who maintain them do so out of something that resembles devotion, a commitment to preserving not just the ships themselves, but the human history embedded in their steel, the lives of the men who served aboard them, the record of what they endured and what they accomplished. There is a particular kind of silence aboard a warship that has been turned into a museum, not the silence of a vessel at rest, which is never truly silent, the ship always settling and creaking in the water, the systems always cycling, the metal always contracting and expanding with the temperature, but a deeper silence, the silence of machinery that was built to be operated and is now only observed. The 16-inch guns of the Iowa class will not fire again. The propulsion plants will not turn the screws again. The crews who trained at these stations and slept in these compartments and died in the turrets and the engine rooms and on the exposed decks under fire, they are old now. Those who remain, and the youngest of them remembers a world that has become, to everyone born after it, a kind of legend. The ships are the archive. They are the physical record of what it cost in steel and labor and lives to project power across the oceans of the world in the middle of the 20th century. They are the proof that such things were built and used and survived. What the Iowa class represents in the full arc of its existence, from the urgent construction of wartime to the final surrender ceremony to the confused revivals of Korea and Vietnam and the Cold War and the Gulf War, and the slow, painful decommissioning at the end, is something more complex than simple military history. It is a story about the gap between the moment a weapon is conceived and the moment it becomes obsolete, and the strange persistence of great machines beyond their own usefulness. The Iowa class was planned in 1938 and built in 1942 and employed in a naval doctrine that was already being superseded by the aircraft carrier before the first ship was commissioned. And yet they survived everything. Enemy fire and accidents and budget cuts and congressional debates and the simple entropy of time. They outlived the Cold War that justified their final modernization. They outlived the Soviet Navy they were built to confront. They outlived the generation of sailors who knew them best. They stand now in 4 American harbors, the largest warships ever retained as museum ships anywhere in the world, receiving visitors who walk their teak decks and peer into their turrets, and try to imagine, in the fluorescent-lit quiet of a museum afternoon, what it was like to stand on these same boards when the guns were firing and the sea was rough and the world was, genuinely and terrifyingly, at war. The steel endures. The archive survives. The names Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin are not forgotten. They are only waiting, as great machines always wait, for the world to remember what it took to build them. And if you think the Iowa class was the last American war machine to outlive its own era, to be mothballed and revived and argued over and finally silenced, Wait until you hear what happened to the aircraft that replaced the battleships, the flying fortresses and heavy bombers that the jet age made obsolete, the machines that carried the weight of American air power through the age of total war, and found themselves, in the end, standing in desert boneyards under the Arizona sun, waiting for someone to remember their names.